Our weekly conversation on matters of faith, and joining us this morning is Pastor Bert Park with Government Street UMC. We wanted to talk about the effect temporary closures have had on churches. If a church closes on a short-term basis because of the pandemic, what's the risk of losing casual churchgoers?
Well, quite honestly, I think the numbers are huge. The problem is there are a lot of what we would call nominal Christians that go to church as sort of to be seen as members of the club, if you will. And there are so many competing influences out there. And once they have been through 3 to 4 months of not being at church and saying, you know, I'm just not sure I really missed it all that much. And they're going to drop off. And I think that's a real, I think there's a huge threat here, probably more so than we've ever seen in the post-World War II generation in terms of church attendance. And I mean that on a permanent basis.
So what's the first step? How do you combat that sort of out of sight, out of mind concept?
Well, you would like to think that they're going to be back at a certain point, but the reality is the further you get away from this, the less chance you have of really reconnecting and thinking about what your faith really means to you. You know, throughout this entire pandemic, our experience here at Government Street has been, there have been those who were dying to return to worship and those who were afraid of dying if they did. And I mean that in all sincerity. We have some older population, and I understand their concerns. But the reality is, if you follow the CDC guidelines, those individuals are eminently safe, and we found our services to be hugely fulfilling on that basis.
You described basically two camps among committed church folks that have emerged that really want to attend in person, and also people that are afraid to attend in person. How do you bridge those fears?
Well, it's difficult. First of all, we recognize, and as a physician, I recognize that some of these individuals have pre-existing conditions that are fearful. But the reality is, if you look at it, this disease process affects, at best, 5% of those seriously, and therefore, you would think that you know, maybe we're making a little too much of this. The other thing I would say as a physician is that the way pandemics behave, this thing ain't going to be over anytime soon. We just have to learn to get together and get on with our lives. And that's our responsibility as a church to make it an eminently safe environment for them.
Another thing is there's still going to be people who are very afraid of this. How do you remind people really that there's no pressure to return in person if they don't feel safe?
I don't think the disciples would have been, the Jesus' first disciples would have stayed at home simply for fear of an unseen virus that it really takes just a small percentage of the population. And I think their faith is tested, and as long as we can assure them that they have the proper safeguards that have been put in place, then they feel eminently safe.
And that was Pastor Bert Park with Government Street United Methodist Church. We thank him for joining us for this edition of